In every crime, there's a reflection. A motive hidden in plain sight. A truth distorted by silence. Welcome to the Forensic Mirror, where psychology meets evidence, and every case reveals more than just what happened, it reveals why. Welcome back, listeners. I am your host, Deja B, and each week we'll dissect the anatomy of guilt, decode the silent patterns, and hold up the mirror to the minds behind the madness. This isn't just true crime, it's truth uncovered. Episode 2, Jack the Ripper and the Origins of Criminal Profiling. Today, we are going back in time once more. Here, we will discuss the facelessness of the man dubbed Jack the Ripper, which allowed him to become a terrifying spectre, a symbol of the unseen darkness lurking within the wealthy capital of a powerful empire. The public was not just afraid of a killer, they were afraid of the unknown, of a force that could strike with impunity in the midst of their city. His elusiveness cemented his place in history, and the desperate attempts to capture him became a powerful catalyst for a new way of thinking about crime. The Ripper case is a direct ancestor to the very tools and techniques criminal investigators rely on today.
The Whitechapel murders of 1888 were a distinct series of crimes attributed to a single, unidentified perpetrator. The police investigation linked the deaths of 5 women to the same murderer, and these women are today known as the Canonical Five. They were Marion Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly, all killed between August and November of that year. While some have speculated that the killer may have been responsible for other murders in the area, such as that of Martha Tabram, the Canonical Five are linked by consistent and escalating habits. The traditional narrative surrounding the Ripper's victims often labels them women of the night, a generalization that has persisted for over a century. However, a closer look at their lives reveals a more complex reality. These women were not a monolithic group, but individuals whose lives were defined by a struggle for survival in the dire conditions of Whitechapel. Their stories are of personal tragedy, resilience, and a fight against a system that offered them few options. Such as Marion Nichols, better known as Polly. Polly was the first canonical victim. She was a 43-year-old divorced mother of 5. Her life was a constant cycle of workhouses and boarding houses, and she struggled with alcohol abuse. On the night of her murder, she was denied a bed at her lodging house because she could not produce the 4 pence required. And if you didn't know what 4 pence means, 4pence was an old coin in the UK worth 1/60th of a pound sterling and was equivalent to 4 pennies. But back to the story. She was last seen by a friend, Emily Holland, just an hour before her death, appearing drunk and desperate for money. Her body was discovered in a location that, while narrow and dark, was still a public road, called Bucks Row, at 3:40 a.m. The second victim was Annie Chapman. She was found just a week after Polly. Annie Chapman was a 47-year-old flower seller and crocheter known to acquaintances as Dark Annie. She had separated from her husband and, at the time of her death, was visibly ill, having been discharged from the Whitechapel infirmary. She had also recently been in a physical altercation, leaving her bruised and particularly vulnerable. Annie was murdered in a backyard on Hanbury Street, which demonstrated the killer's growing confidence, as he not only cut her throat but also removed her internal organs. And on September 30th, 1888, was a night of unrivaled violence, with 2 murders occurring in a span of 45 minutes and a half-mile of one another. The third victim was Elizabeth Stride, better known as Long Liz. She was a Swedish immigrant. Her body was discovered in Dutfield's yard, just off Burner Street. Uniquely, her body showed no signs of the extensive mutilation seen in the other victims, with only her throat cut. This suggests that the killer was interrupted during the attack. Multiple witnesses saw Stride in her final hours, including a man named Israel Schwartz who saw a man attack her and throw her to the ground. The fact that she was found with throat lozenges still clutched in her left hand points to a swift and sudden end. With our fourth victim, Catherine Eddowes, or Kate, less than an hour after Longley's death, Kate was found brutally murdered in Mitre Square, within the jurisdiction of the City of London Police. Her murder was particularly bold, as she was taken from police custody just minutes before her death, having been arrested for public drunkenness. The mutilations to her body were extensive, with her face disfigured, her abdomen cut open, and her womb and a kidney removed. This murder on the same night seemed to be an expression of the killer's unfulfilled rage from Long Li's murder, interrupted attack. The last of the canonical victims was Mary Jane Kelly. Mary Jane's death was on November 9, 1888, and it was the most horrific. Unlike the others, she was murdered indoors, in the privacy of her room at 13 Miller's Court. This afforded her killer an extensive period of time to disembowel and mutilate her body, a process that likely took approximately 2 hours. Her body was mutilated beyond recognition, with her organs removed and placed around the room in a grotesque display. The way the public and press at the time chose to portray these women as one-dimensional women of the night reveals a significant aspect of the social context. While many of the victims were indeed forced into sex work by extreme poverty, the sensationalism of the murders stripped them of their individual identities, reducing their complex lives to a simple label. The casual dehumanization served to distance the respectable public from the victims and, in doing so, made them seem like acceptable targets. The tragic irony is that the same social conditions of overcrowding, neglect, and lack of opportunity that drove these women to the streets were the very conditions that allowed their killer to operate unseen. The clear escalation of violence in the Ripper's attacks, from the initial outdoor murders to the protracted, ritualistic disembowelment of Mary Jane Kelly, is not a random progression. It suggests a growing arrogance on the part of the killer, whose successes and the police's inability to apprehend him fueled his internal, sadistic drive. The privacy of Mary Jane Kelly's room provided the opportunity to live out his deepest, most violent fantasies. This progression from hurried, outdoor attacks to a private, controlled, and intensely brutal display of post-mortem degradation provides crucial insight into the killer's psychological state. The police investigation into the Whitechapel murders was constrained by the limitations of late 19th century law enforcement. Investigators did not have access to modern forensic tools and relied primarily on meticulous written descriptions, crime scene sketches, and rudimentary photography. The identification of individuals through unique biological markers, such as DNA testing, was not possible, and fingerprinting was not yet a standardized practice. Consequently, the investigative focus centered on collecting any observable clues that might connect a suspect to the crimes. Despite these significant limitations, there were moments of scientific advancement during the investigation. Police surgeons played a pioneering role in the early development of forensic pathology. They carefully documented the depth, angle, and type of cuts found on the victims' bodies, which provided essential information about the weapon used and the killer's possible skill. This analysis led to public speculation that the murderer might be a surgeon or butcher with anatomical knowledge. But there were rolls of letters in the Ripper case. The enduring legacy of the Ripper case is closely tied to the numerous letters sent to media outlets and Scotland Yard by individuals claiming to be the killer. 2 of these letters have become particularly infamous in the history of the case. The Dear Boss letter, addressed to the Central News Agency, was the first communication to use the name Jack the Ripper. Written in red ink, it taunted the police and ominously promised to clip the lady's ears off. Notably, when Catherine Eddowes was found with part of her ear missing just days after the letter was received, the letter gained a chilling credibility. The Jack the Ripper murders were deeply rooted in the severe social challenges facing London in 1888. Whitechapel, the epicenter of the crimes, was characterized by extreme poverty, overcrowding, and neglect. Residents lived in cramped, unsanitary conditions, surrounded by open sewers and accumulating garbage. The city's rapid population growth had outpaced its infrastructure, resulting in families often sharing a single room. Housing was so inadequate that many individuals, including the victims, resorted to walking the streets or sleeping in doss houses with only the most minimal amenities. For many women, the lack of available decently paid work meant that sex work was sometimes the only means of survival. These harsh circumstances not only victimized those living in Whitechapel, but also created an environment where crime flourished unchecked. The district's maze of dingy alleyways and dark courtyards, with numerous entry and exit points, made effective policing nearly impossible. Some areas were considered so perilous that police officers hesitated to enter them. This lack of police presence allowed the killer to remain at large, operating with impunity. The very desperation that forced women onto the streets, coupled with the disorder that rendered eyewitness accounts unreliable, provided the perfect conditions for the Ripper to take advantage of the community's vulnerabilities. In addition to its poverty and chaos, Whitechapel was a focal point for ethnic tensions in Victorian London. The neighbourhood was home to many Jewish immigrants, who had fled violent persecution in Eastern Europe. Competition for housing and jobs heightened existing anxieties and prejudices. The public and press were quick to project their fears onto the killer, speculating that he was a foreigner or a Jewish person, despite there being no evidence to support these claims. This scapegoating reveals how the Ripper case became a vehicle for the community to externalize and justify its own biases and fears during a time of social upheaval. The role of the press was pivotal in shaping the public's perception of both the crimes and the killer. Sensationalist newspapers, such as The Star, engaged in intense coverage, transforming the murders from local tragedies into a national obsession. The press fueled a climate of fear and panic, eagerly providing a narrative that was both terrifying and captivating. The moniker Jack the Ripper originated from a letter widely believed to be a journalistic hoax, quickly replacing earlier names like the Whitechapel Fiend. In doing so, the media did more than simply report the crimes. They played an active role in constructing a myth around the killer, one that overshadowed the reality of the events. The silence of the police and the public's hunger for information created an environment ripe for sensationalist journalism to flourish, cementing the Ripper as a legendary figure in popular imagination.
And so, as we close episode 2, we reflect on the legacy of the Whitechapel murders that is defined by its irresolution. The fact that the case was officially closed after only 4 years, with no one ever being charged, has left an indelible stain on London's history. The legend of Jack the Ripper endures not just because of the gruesome details, but because it represents a complete failure of justice. The killer left no name, only blood, fear, and a legacy that still haunts forensic science and criminal psychology to this day. The central question remains: was Jack the Ripper a man, or a mirror held up to Victorian society's darkest truths? He was, in fact, both. He was a deeply disturbed man, whose brutal actions were meticulously documented, and whose psychological profile continues to be studied by experts today. But the image of the Ripper, the terrifying, faceless phantom who stalked the foggy streets of London, was a grotesque reflection of a society grappling with its own failures. The poverty that forced his victims into desperation, the xenophobia that fueled public suspicion, and the media that sensationalized the horror for profit were all elements of a larger, unaddressed sickness. The unsolved case became a symbol of Victorian society's unresolved social and moral dilemmas, a dark legend that continues to reflect our own fascination with the human capacity for cruelty and the enduring power of the unknown. Stay tuned for the next episode, where we explore more crime stories across the globe. Thank you for listening.